Daniel just got a dividend payment, money that shows up whether or not he does anything at all. Drake, watching, assumes there's some secret number where this replaces a paycheck entirely. There is a real number. It's just bigger and more specific than most people expect. No mansion buying fantasy math here, just the real formula, using real fund yields. That tells you exactly what living off dividends actually requires. Quick one before we get into this. If the real numbers behind passive income are useful, hit subscribe, new video every week. The math behind living off dividends is one formula. Take the annual income you need, divide it by the dividend yield of your portfolio, and the result is the portfolio size required. If you need $50,000 a year and your portfolio yields 3.5%, you need $50,000 divided by 0.035, about $1.43 million invested. That's the entire concept. Everything else in this video is just filling in realistic numbers for that formula. Notice the relationship. A higher yield lowers the portfolio required, and a lower yield raises it. That single lever is why so much dividend investing content obsesses over yield. It's the one number that most directly changes the size of the target. Using real, current numbers instead of round ones, the Schwab U.S. Dividend Equity ETF, ticker SCHD, has a trailing dividend yield in the 3.1 to 3.5% range. The Vanguard High Dividend Yield ETF, ticker VYM, yields somewhat less, roughly 2 to 2.4%. Despite the name, VYM isn't automatically the higher-yielding fund of the two. SCHD's quality-focused stock screen currently produces the larger payout. Running the formula at SCHD's roughly 3.5%, $30,000 a year needs about $857,000 invested. $50,000 a year needs about $1.43 million. $100,000 a year needs close to $2.86 million. At VYM's lower 2.3% yield, those same income targets need $1.3 million, $2,017 million, and $4.35 million respectively. The yield difference alone shifts the required portfolio by well over $1 million at the higher income target. It's tempting to look at those numbers and go hunting for the highest yield available, but yield and quality aren't the same thing. And an unusually high yield is frequently a warning sign, not a bargain. A stock's yield rises automatically when its price falls, which means some high-yield stocks are simply companies in trouble, not companies being generous. This is why funds like SCHD specifically screen for underlying financial quality, profitability, cash flow, and a track record of maintaining or growing the payout, rather than simply ranking stocks by yield and buying the top of the list. The goal isn't the highest number today. It's a payout that's still being made, and ideally growing 10 and 20 years from now. Quality also shows up in a formal label. Dividend aristocrats are S&P 500 companies that have raised their dividend every single year for at least 25 consecutive years. Dividend kings have done it for 50 years or more. Neither label guarantees the streak continues, but both are a genuinely useful screening shortcut for the kind of underlying business discipline that keeps a payout alive through recessions. Dividend cuts do happen, even to seemingly reliable companies. A large number of real estate investment trusts, for example, cut or suspended their dividends during 2020's pandemic disruption. This is the actual argument for using a diversified fund like SCHD or VYM instead of a handful of individual high-yield stocks. One company's cut barely dents a fund holding hundreds of positions, but it devastates a portfolio concentrated in just a few names. Dividend taxation matters here more than most people realize. Qualified dividends, the kind paid by most established U.S. companies, including SCHD and VYM's holdings, are taxed at long-term capital gains rates, not ordinary income rates. For 2025, that's 0% for taxable income up to $48,350 for single filers, 15% up to $533,400, and 20% above that. That 0% bracket is a real, meaningful detail. Someone whose only income is dividends and whose total taxable income stays under roughly $48,350 as a single filer can potentially owe zero federal tax on that income. This is one of the more underrated advantages of dividend income specifically, compared to the same dollar amount coming from a regular paycheck. Where the dividend portfolio actually sits matters too. In a standard taxable brokerage account, qualified dividends get taxed each year at those capital gains rates from a moment ago, even if the money is reinvested and never touched. Inside a traditional IRA or 401k, dividends grow completely tax-deferred, but withdrawals later are taxed as ordinary income regardless of how the money was earned. Inside a Roth IRA, qualified withdrawals in retirement are entirely tax-free, including all the dividend income that built the balance. One caveat worth flagging: dividends from real estate investment trusts are usually taxed as ordinary income, not at the lower qualified dividend rate, because of how REITs are legally structured. SCHD and VYM aren't REIT-heavy funds, but anyone building a dividend portfolio that includes REIT-focused funds for the higher yield should expect a different, generally less favorable tax outcome on that portion. While still building toward the target, dividends should almost always be reinvested rather than spent. A dividend reinvestment plan, or DRIP, automatically uses each payout to buy more shares of the same holding, compounding the position without any manual effort. This is what actually shortens the road to the number calculated earlier. A dividend spent today is a dividend that stops compounding today. Once the portfolio has actually reached the target size, the DRIP gets switched off, and the same payments start flowing to a checking account instead, the exact moment the phrase living off dividends stops being aspirational and becomes literal. There's a second lever besides current yield: dividend growth. SCHD has raised its payout for 14 consecutive years, with a 10-year dividend growth rate around 10 to 11% annually and an expense ratio of just 0.06%. VYM's dividend growth has been steadier but slower, roughly 5% long-term, with an even lower expense ratio of 0.04%. In practice, this means SCHD's starting yield tends to compound upward faster. The yield on your original investment keeps climbing even if the fund's quoted yield today looks similar to VYM's. This is the actual trade-off between the two funds, and by extension between any high current yield option and any dividend growth option. SCHD's lower headline yield today is offset by faster compounding of that yield over time, while VYM's simplicity and rock-bottom cost still make it a reasonable, if slower growing, choice for the same formula from earlier. Reaching a portfolio in the high 6 or low 7 figures obviously doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't require picking individual stocks either. Broad index funds and ETFs, vehicles that hold hundreds of underlying companies at once, offer built-in diversification with expense ratios as low as 0.03 to 0.20%, and most brokers now support fractional shares, meaning any dollar amount can be invested regardless of a single share's price. Dollar cost averaging, investing a fixed amount on a regular schedule regardless of price, remains the most emotionally sustainable way to build this position over years, because it removes the pressure of trying to time an entry point and simply keeps the contributions flowing. It's worth naming the alternative approach directly, since it's the more common one in mainstream retirement planning. The total return strategy, often summarized by the 4% rule, has a retiree withdraw a set percentage of the whole portfolio each year, selling shares as needed, regardless of whether that money came from dividends or price appreciation. A dividends-only approach like the one in this video avoids ever needing to sell a share, which some retirees find psychologically easier, but it also means the portfolio itself may need to be somewhat larger than a total return plan would require, since it's relying on yield alone rather than yield plus growth. One practical detail for anyone actually living off this income: most dividend ETFs, including SCHD and VYM, pay out quarterly rather than monthly. Retirees aiming for a steady monthly paycheck-like feel often combine a few funds with staggered payment schedules, sometimes called building a dividend calendar, so that at least one payment lands most months, smoothing out what would otherwise be 4 large lump sums a year instead of 12 smaller ones. This dividend target isn't a replacement for retirement accounts. It usually sits alongside them. An employer 401k match comes first, since it's an immediate guaranteed return. IRA contributions, capped at $7,000 a year for 2025, come next. since the tax treatment inside those accounts is generally better than a standard brokerage account. A dedicated dividend-focused portfolio, taxable or otherwise, is what most people build over and above those accounts specifically for pre-retirement or supplemental cash flow. For many people, some of that $143 million target ends up sitting inside a 401k or IRA rather than a separate taxable account, which changes the tax treatment on withdrawal, but doesn't change the underlying yield math from earlier at all. A quick mechanical note worth knowing: to actually receive a dividend, an investor has to own the shares before the ex-dividend date. Anyone who buys on or after that date doesn't get that particular payout. It goes to whoever held the shares the day before. The record date is when the company checks its ownership list, and the payment date, often a few weeks later, is when the cash or reinvestment actually happens. This matters mainly for anyone timing a purchase around a specific payout rather than simply holding long-term. There's also a real risk worth naming for the withdrawal phase specifically. A market downturn that hits right as someone starts relying on the portfolio is far more damaging than the same downturn hitting 10 years earlier, because there's less time for the balance to recover before money starts coming out. This is called sequence of returns risk. And it's actually one place where a dividends-only approach has a genuine advantage over total return withdrawals. The dividend payment itself doesn't shrink just because the share price temporarily drops, even though total return withdrawals would be selling into that same drop. Put a real timeline on it. Someone investing $1,000 a month into a dividend-focused index fund, reinvesting every payout and averaging a reasonable long-term total return can realistically build toward the $1 million range over roughly 20 to 25 years of consistent contributions. Not a get-rich-quick outcome, but a genuinely achievable one for someone starting in their 20s or 30s. Starting later simply means either a higher monthly contribution or a longer runway. The formula from earlier doesn't change either way. Running the actual math on that timeline, investing $1,000 a month at an assumed 8% average annual return reaches $1.43 million in about 29 and a half years. Increasing the contribution to $1,500 a month cuts that down to roughly 25 years. At $2,000 a month, the same target arrives in about 22 years. The contribution amount changes the timeline far more dramatically than most people expect. An extra $500 a month can shave 4 to 5 years off the entire plan. One more real factor: that $50,000 a year target isn't fixed either. At a typical 3% annual inflation rate, $50,000 of today's spending power costs close to $104,700 25 years from now. This doesn't invalidate the plan. It just means the honest version of running your own numbers should use tomorrow's dollars, not today's, especially for a goal this far out. It's also worth pointing out that none of this requires full retirement as the goal. The same formula works at any scale. Someone who just wants $10,000 a year in supplemental dividend income, on top of a regular paycheck, needs roughly $286,000 invested at SCHD's 3.5% yield, a far more reachable milestone than the seven-figure numbers from earlier, and a realistic target for someone a decade or two into consistent investing rather than someone already at the finish line. The actual takeaway isn't a specific dollar figure to chase blindly. It's running your own number, honestly, using your own required income and a realistic yield, so the target stops being abstract and starts being something to actually build toward. And the starting point for any of this is genuinely small. Most brokers now allow automatic recurring investments as low as $25 or $50 a month into a fund like SCHD or VYM, with fractional shares handling whatever amount doesn't divide evenly into a full share price. The seven-figure and six-figure numbers in this video are the destination, not the entry requirement. The formula from earlier works the same way at every size. From a first $50 deposit to a multi-million-dollar balance decades later. Living off dividends is math, not magic. Required income divided by yield equals the portfolio needed. At SCHD's roughly 3.5% yield, $50,000 a year needs about $1.43 million invested. At VYM's lower yield, the same income needs closer to $2.17 million. Qualified dividends get taxed at capital gains rates, sometimes at 0%. None of it requires chasing the highest yield available or picking individual stocks over diversified funds. It requires reinvesting consistently, starting small if needed, until the real number, not a fantasy one, is actually reached. This video is for educational purposes only and is not personalized financial advice. If this made the math finally click, subscribe, new video every week. Next up, the tax strategy the ultra-wealthy use to never sell a single